Huh, should I attack the Naus player? Let me get out the flowchart. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Playing with Power podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things cEDH, EDH, and Magic the Gathering. I am your host, Ryan.
And I am your host, Callahan, and today we are going to talk about when to break the rules of cEDH. Not the actual rules of Magic. We're not trying to create any cheaters here, but instead we're going to be talking about a little bit the heuristics that a lot of people learn when they're playing cEDH and that people tell you and that kind of stuff. Why they're helpful, but also when you should deviate from those heuristics that everybody is always preaching. But first, we're going to pay the bills. Tickets for our latest Mox Master tournaments are on sale now. Compete for $2,000 in prizes and points toward the Mox Masters Invitational coming this October in Columbus, Ohio. Tickets sell out for each event, so go to moxmasters.events and sign up today. Our merchandise is now available in our store. We have dice, coins, playmats, tokens, sleeves, and more available. Go to playingwithpowermtg.com and help support the channel. You can also support us on Patreon. Patrons get access to our Discord, webcam league, play days, early access to videos, names in the credits of our show, exclusive videos, merchandise, and even the ability to be on an episode. There are tiers for everyone, so go to patreon.com/playingwithpowermtg and help support the show. Also, if you're looking to sponsor the podcast, please reach out to Ryan's email in the podcast notes or the YouTube description. Wherever you're watching, you can find Ryan there.
Or about around there, maybe. All right. And in every episode, we do a Patreon shout out. And today's Patreon shout out goes to Nathan Smith.
Thank you, Nathan. We appreciate you a lot.
We appreciate you.
So, when to break the rules in cEDH. Up top, I mentioned that rather than talking about the actual rules of Magic the Gathering today, we're talking more about not the unspoken rules that we've talked about in a previous podcast, but these are kind of the things that people explicitly talk about all the time as heuristics to help you level up your cEDH game. Of course, many of the things we're discussing today are heuristics because they're useful. Like, people talk about these things in the first place because they are very useful to know. They'll help you identify common pain points where the decision might be a little tough, but maybe it's not as tough as it seems. And they help you kind of go on autopilot, so to speak, in these games of cEDH, which, especially over a long tournament day or over a long day of even just jamming with your friends, just avoiding these decision points, make it a little easier on yourself can really make playing cEDH easier, which leaves up more brain space to think about the harder decisions, etc., etc. But when you are in autopilot, sometimes you don't always make the best decisions. And a big way of leveling up your cEDH game, in my opinion, is knowing when to break off of this heuristic autopilot, especially in some of the specific ways we're going to talk about today.
This is an interesting one because I think autopilot really describes it well, but we unfortunately sometimes get into a trap where autopilot goes a little bit too far. And it's really difficult because you get players that get into cEDH or even in competitive formats and they're like, okay, these are the heuristics you really need to follow to help with, like you said, your brain space and stuff like that. All right, now make sure you get all those into your mind and cement those, except for this particular case or except for this particular time where we're like, oh, no, you're not supposed to do it. You're like, you just told me to do it. Why are you telling me not to now? And so it can be a little bit confusing. But if you understand the reasoning behind why certain things are there, then you have a better understanding of why you should break those rules when those particular circumstances surface. And that's really what we're trying to get at today.
Yeah, certainly. And kind of another really small note, too. I think something that's important to remember around a lot of these heuristics is that when you're in a game and somebody decides to go against these heuristics, I think it's okay to question their decision making, but just don't be a
dick. Is that the word you're looking for? Don't be a dick about it.
Don't be rude about it.
There we go. Okay,
don't be rude about it. I have fallen into that trap sometimes before. I've given somebody, really, you're not attacking the Naus player, you're attacking me. And I think that stuff's okay sometimes. But everyone in the game is making their own decisions. And the more you play cEDH, the more you realize how little of a control you have over the other players in your pod, regardless of how much you would like. And so if other players in your pod are breaking these heuristics, and unless you think that they're really just objectively making the worst decision in the world and you think you can convince them otherwise, it's okay. They probably have their reasons. Maybe like the reasons we're going to talk about right now.
Yeah, definitely. And that's actually a really good sidebar too. Just because somebody might be breaking said rules that we might be going into today, that doesn't mean that you have to get rude or you have to strong arm them or bully them or something to be. You need to do this. You need to do that. Like you said, everyone's making their own decisions. Everyone's playing their own part of this game, their own 25% of this game, and they're all trying to get to the same common goal. And sometimes it can actually be a tell. It can be a thing. Be like, oh, why are they attacking me? These seem like really bad attacks. He or she's probably got a board wipe in hand. That might be something we need to be aware of. So that's just an obviously arbitrary example, but it's a cue that you can sometimes pick up on.
I, as the Malcolm player, am not attacking the Adnos player because his life total is already quite low, and I need your life total to be closer to his life total so I can actually kill you all with Glinthorn Buccaneer.
Exactly.
Stop coming at me.
Yeah, exactly. See that's an excellent point. See, those types of things, you're like, why wouldn't you attack the Adnos player? So interesting. All right, awesome. Let's dive into our first one here. And so this one is across many spaces. This isn't just a cEDH specific kind of heuristic. This is something that you hear in all of them. And that is, don't counter the tutor, counter what the tutor gets. Meaning that if you have something that counters a tutor of some sort, maybe a demonic tutor or whatever that might be, wait till they actually go get the card and then counter whatever that card is, because you just 2-for-1'd them. Ooh, that's really good card advantage and good tempo and blah, 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 blah. But it depends on what they're getting. So I would say a really classic example of this would be like, oh, there's a Tymna Thrasios player and they are just grinding value, and they cast a demonic tutor. You're like, huh, well, I'm going to counter what this tutor gets, and then I'm going to get them for this. And then they go and they get a Gaia's Cradle. Oops.
Ooh, got him.
Couldn't counter that. And so now you're stuck in a thing where they suddenly have this burst of 7-8 mana, or depending on whatever the board state is, and you had a chance to technically stop that. Now that may or may not be the be all end all of a particular game, but that's just an arbitrary example of sometimes it is okay to counter the tutor. That is the rule that we're talking about to break. The rule that you normally see is you don't counter the tutor, you counter what the tutor fetches, but in certain examples, it might actually be better to just counter the tutor, especially if it's something that is a little bit harder to counter or it's a little bit more narrow from what you have from an interaction standpoint might be. But sometimes it's okay to break that rule and actually just counter the tutor itself.
Yeah, like you said, Ryan, there is kind of a good reason why this is a heuristic in the first place, right? If you counter what they get, yeah, like you said, you go up on mana because they spent the mana into the tutor. You go up on card advantage because they spent a card to put this other card into their hand, which you then successfully countered. So like a lot of the times countering the threat or what have you, rather than what the tutor gets, is just a great gameplay decision. However, yes, I think the area in which you have to think about this the hardest is when you have a much more limited counterspell in hand. I played in a tournament this last Saturday at the time of recording, and I actually got myself with this. I was like, all right, my opponent is casting a demonic tutor, and I had a Flusterstorm in hand. The storm count was like high enough that I could have like gotten them TM, right? It was an Agila player. I said, all right, I think they're in the position where they're going to go and get Adnos right now rather than like something like Derevi. I kind of made the bet that I thought, given the game state, they were going to get Adnos rather than getting Derevi. And therefore, I stuck with like heuristic. I'm not going to counter the tutor. I'm going to wait for them to tap out to cast their Adnos, and then I'm going to Flusterstorm them, even if it's like on the end of another person's turn or whatever. And I made the wrong bet, and I lost that game of cEDH, unfortunately, because they did go and get Derevi because they had the Jeweled Lotus in hand that they had been holding and not playing because I had a Mystic Remora and so on and so forth. But in that situation, rather than trying to play that kind of calculus in my head, I think I think it was like borderline almost objectively correct too, in this specific situation, knowing what I know about, the Najeela deck. Even if there was a chance that they were going to go and get Derevi that I couldn't interact with, which obviously that's what they did, I should have countered their Demonic Tutor with my Flusterstorm and stopped them from being able to go and get Derevi and go on to win the game, right? And I think that's kind of one of the really big situations. Those are the kind of situations you really have to look out for if you have a limited counterspell in hand, especially as people have been playing with more and more Grand Abolishers and Ranger Captain of Eoses and so on and so forth. And as our counterspell suite continues to be fairly restrictive, if we think about a lot of decks that people play, what's going to be countering a creature out of there? There's Force of Will.
2 to 3 spells total.
Force of Will.
Yeah, Force of Will, Pact of Negation.
Technically.
And then maybe some people run Mana Drain.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something you really got to watch out for. I think as more and more, as if you're playing against a white deck, definitely look out for the creature silence effect. If they're in the position where you just lose to them jamming a Grand Abolisher that you don't have the Force of Will, yeah, you probably want to counter that Demonic Tutor or that Vampiric Tutor into a Timna draw or whatever, what have you. One thing I do want to call out really quick, I have seen some people try to apply this heuristic to Adnaz. They're like, oh, don't counter the Adnaz. Counter whatever they're going to get off the Adnaz. Do you know what they're going to get off the Adnaz? They're going to get their win con and 2 counter spells to protect it, and on top of the counter spell they already had in their hand. Counter the Adnaz. There's no such thing as a value Adnaz. Just counter that. Don't let them tutor off their Adnaz and then try to counter whatever they get. It's not a winning proposition in my extensive experience.
Yep. And that goes back to just what the original heuristic is trying to say. 2 for 1 them. That's what this heuristic is. 2 for 1 them.
Yep.
Adnaz doesn't do that.
No.
It 12 for 2's you. It completely sways completely in their favor every time. Like you said, they get their win gone plus protection twice, and so that just doesn't work. And I think what you said really when you said about limited interaction or limited counter magic, that's really, I think, the key point when you should maybe get out of your autopilot mode, like we've been talking about. You snap out of autopilot when they're like, oh, Demonic Tutor, and I think they have a Breach in hand or something. Well, I don't want to counter whatever that is to the graveyard. Or they have a Savine's Reclamation in their graveyard. I don't want to counter whatever that is. They're just going to get it back. I'd rather whatever it is just stay in their library. So I'm going to counter I have a Miscast in hand or I have a Flusterstorm in hand, but I'm not going to be able to counter Breach because maybe I don't have a Swan Song. And even with that, the game is still over. So you have to sometimes look at those cues and say, this is an area where I'm going to break the rules here, and I don't want it to even be in their hand or graveyard. I do not want any of those situations to present themselves. I'd rather it stay in their library and them having to spend more resources to try and get it, because then I have a better chance. And that's really what the key is here.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those scenarios too, where like many things in cEDH, you can kind of be very much rewarded by paying attention to what people are doing and what people are seeming to care about in the game. If you notice that somebody has been maybe just sitting tight or whatever, and maybe they already have a Thoracle in hand or whatever, and they're going to go and try to go get a counterspell off their Demonic Tutor to try to back up their stuff. I can't really tell you how to intuit that stuff. I think you can kind of pick up on it over time. But as you continue to level up and get better at cEDH and notice how people playing the game can kind of leak to you what is in their hand or whatnot, definitely look out for the Demonic Tutor for Force of Will too. I've lost the game to that more than once.
Yes, exactly. And in that case, you might have a situation where, your interaction might work in hand, but they are also jamming a win con on top of it. And so they just now have protection and you're just out of that game. So we are once again saying, don't automatically just ignore this rule. This rule is here for a reason. The don't counter the tutor, counter what the tutor gets. That's absolutely fine. If you have a Force of Will, let them tutor. Let them 2 for 1. But if you have something that's more limited, consider what they might be getting. Like you said in an Najeela example, they might be getting Derevi, and you can't counter that with your Miscast. So think about that, and before you go too much on autopilot and start losing games because of that heuristic. Okay, so So let's talk about the next one. So that one is don't counter their commander. Mm-hmm. This is usually applying to something like Crom or Timna or something like that. Don't bother countering their commander. They're just going to recast it, or don't bother countering their commander.
It's just a little value engine, Ryan.
Yeah, it's just a value engine like Timna or Crom. Don't worry about that. Just let that resolve every time. And you want to save your interaction for more of the game-winning kind of spells. Don't do that. And that is usually frequently kind of the rule. Be like, a Crom will usually always resolve. And the reason that Crom will usually always resolve is it doesn't win the game on the spot. But there are times when this should be ignored. So one of the first reasons that I would counter a Crom is if they try to burn all of their hand up to try and get a turn 1 Crom on the board. They, Chrome Mox, imprint something, play a land, cast a Dark Ritual, cast a Mana Vault, tap that Mana Vault, go get, and do all this stuff. And they have 1 card in hand and they cast Crom. I'm going to counter their Crom. Yeah. Why? Because it completely...
They're just, at that point, they're out of the game.
You have just, removal. Yep. You have just said with 1 counter spell, target, you are now in a 3-player game. Target player loses the game. It's going to take so much for them to get back in that game that, yes, you didn't spend that interaction on maybe a game-winning spell.
Oracle or what have you, yeah.
But you did effectively take 1 player out of this game. And you'll very frequently see a lot of pushback from not only the person that is you're countering the spell of, but the other players at the table.
Other people in the game, yeah.
Yeah, they'll say, don't do that. Don't counter their commander. Be like, no, this is Crom, and these are 3 Grixis decks that are trying to storm and trying to do a bunch of crazy stuff. I'm going to take this player out of the game. Or it's something like their Timna. They have 3 attackers literally on board and 2 cards in hand. I'm going to counter that Timna. And the reason I'm going to counter that Timna is because they're going to go from 3 cards to 6 cards. They're going to double their hand size with a cast of 1 spell. That doesn't even put them down on a card. So there are times when it is okay to counter their commander, especially if you find yourself in a position where giving your opponent a bunch more cards is not going to be advantageous to you winning that game. So that's the heuristic in how to break it.
Yeah, certainly. This heuristic, I think, does make a lot of sense. It can be hard to, in some ways, if we're thinking about card advantage in a very traditional sense, countering a commander is kind of a bad proposition from that regard. It's coming from their command zone, so they're not like quote unquote going down a card from their hand. You're going down a card from your hand to counter the commander. This also kind of works in a heuristic of like what commanders you're trying to like straight up remove from the battlefield if you have a removal spell, right? This is kind of in the same vein. You're going down a card. They never went down a card to cast their commander in the first place. And since it's a commander, it's just going to go back to the command zone. And in return, they can pay a little more. They can pay a little more mana to get it back. So then you're like down another card in a form or fashion. What it can be is like you alluded to with your like go all out to cast Crom, or I've seen a lot of people go out to cast Tevish Zot, and that kind of stuff. The more expensive commanders. Or, they go all in to cast Timna. I've seen people go all in to cast Timna at 5, et cetera, et cetera. It can be a really big tempo swing. Like we know that Crom, when somebody goes Jeweled Lotus, Mana Vault, land, pitch a Simian Spirit Guide, cast Crom. If we counter that spell, they're not out of the game, but their tempo has been absolutely obliterated. They have no more tempo. They're just done. For the next 5 turns, they may not meaningfully impact the game. They're going to spend their next turn playing land, and then they're going to spend their 3rd turn casting Timna, and then they're going to start drawing some extra cards, and maybe they'll get back into the game. But that's just so much different than them having a Crom on turn 1, as you alluded to. Timna is, I think Crom and Timna are definitely like, we said Crom, Timna / other commanders in our notes, but I think these 2 commanders are definitely the 2 that it comes up the most around, because they're just kind of just like arbitrary value engines. They're if you sure Crom is a little scary because he's a 4/4 like flying haste. That adds up a little quick in the little slower games, but Timna's just so innocuous to look at. You know, you look at Timna, you're like, oh, it's a little 2/2. Oh, they're going to draw a card off their little flying Thopter from their Loyal Apprentice. That's so cute. That adds up so fast. They have a Loyal Apprentice and they have a random other guy. They're going to hit you with their Grand Abolisher they have for some reason. And
you let resolve because you didn't counter it.
You didn't counter it off the demonic tutor. Yeah, exactly, right. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. So be heads up. I think that's the biggest advice I can offer about all of this stuff, but especially don't counter Crom, don't counter Timna, don't bother removing these cards. These are the people play these in the command zone for a reason rather than like a quote unquote more focused option. You know, if somebody wanted to play 4-color pile with a more focused plan in the command zone, they could definitely do it. But there's a reason why they're playing Crom. There's a reason why they're playing Timna. There's a reason why they're playing Thrasios, right? These cards just sit there and draw you cards. And when you're playing 100 powerful cards, every single card that you could draw is probably very good and puts you ahead of your opponents. So don't be afraid to counter that Crom. Don't be afraid to counter that Timna. Never counter a Malcolm. Don't bother. It's not worth it.
Says the Malcolm player. Don't bother removing your, don't bother using your Red Blast on Malcolm. I have a Ristic Study in hand, I promise. I just haven't cast it yet. But just be heads up. If somebody puts wants so badly to invest all their resources into putting like Timna or Crom or Thrasios for the third time into play or whatever, think about why that is. Look at their hand. Think about what if they've cast tutors. Think about how many cards they've drawn this game, and then compare that to everybody else. Like, do you significantly raise your percent by taking somebody off that advantage engine? If yes, then definitely think about countering it, removing it. 90% of the time, you're going to let Crom resolve. You're going to let Timna resolve. You're going to let Thrasios resolve. You're going to let Malcolm resolve. You're going to let Winota resolve 10% of the time, right? But sometimes it's justified. Often it's justified. But just be on the lookout for when you can really gain some percent by avoiding this very specific heuristic. Yep. And like you said, 90% of the time, they resolve.
Yep.
Save it for something more threatening. That's absolutely
true. They resolve.
True.
They stay on the board through a couple turn rotations rather than somebody burning their only Swords to Plowshares on them. You know, it's not often that this happens.
Yep. And I will say 100%, if you ever crack an LED to cast your commander, I'm going to counter your commander.
You're going to counter the commander?
I'm going to counter your commander. Don't listen to me. I'm a horrible Magic player, but I'm sorry. If you're cracking LED to cast Crom and you're discarding your hand, you don't get a hand or a commander. I'm going to counter it. That's just, it's too good. It's too much value. I'm sorry.
You know, Ryan, I think that's so fair. I think I've seen you do that at least once. Yeah. If you're cracking LED, you're discarding your two other cards in hand and really just trying to get in on Crom plus Timna or something like that. Woo boy.
Yep. You're getting blown out. So
I'll take that right from you.
Yep. You are getting blown out.
Well, we are going to step away quickly for an ad break. Don't go anywhere. We have Attacking the Naus player and Don't Feed the Fish and or Ristic Study coming up.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Card Conduit. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I've used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value of my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have 3 main services. Their standard service lets you send them unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best buy list price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half of the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their new sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would have from a major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list priced against the specific condition of a card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the show notes or the description, or use the promo code POWER, you'll also get 10% off their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's podcast.
All right, and welcome back. Ryan and I still here talking about when to break the rules in cEDH. Of course, by rules, we mean the heuristics you hear about so often. And next up, we're going to be talking about the one that maybe you've heard the most. Maybe it's the one you've heard the second most. I'd be shocked if the one we talk about last isn't the one you've heard the most. But this one is always attack the ad naus player. Or this one kind of often boils down to like always attack the most threatening player who's playing black. Because yes, it's easy to say ad naus because as we all know, ad nauseum, the more life you have, the more cards you're going to like, not draw, but get off of it. Draw, pretty much. The more cards you're going to be able to draw off of your ad nauseum, the more life you have. But there's a lot of other effects that in black that they can use very effectively, such as, if their life total's low enough, they might not be able to reanimate their Razagath, or they might think twice about reanimating some other big thing, or their Necropotence or Necropotence, or, what have you, however the kids are saying it these days. They might not be able to draw as many cards off of that, so on and so forth. There's a lot of very powerful cards that black plays that uses their life total. So a lot of people, when they go to combat, especially those who are from a competitive background know how hard combat is. And those who are from an EDH background know how annoying combat is, choosing who to attack. And these kind of dynamics actually combine very well in the cEDH in that you have three options, and it is incredibly hard to do combat correctly in any application of Magic the Gathering. And so a lot of people just get to sidestep this, and they say, oh, yeah, you're playing black. Haha, I'm going to attack the ad naus player. So, do 2 damage to an ad naus player. They're drawing 2.5 less cards or whatever when they go to ad naus, which is a pretty good rate of return. So, therefore, we have this heuristic. Always attack the ad naus player. Now, Ryan, why might we want to break this cEDH rule?
This rule is actually really interesting, and you'll actually hear people say it out loud, like you said. They'll say it out loud.
Yeah, I'm just going to attack the ad naus player, and then whoever is playing black is like, yep, that's fair enough. You got me. I have no blockers. All right, I'll go to 35.
Yeah. So you'll see a Crom player, and you'll see them, and they just spend all their resources casting their turn 1 Crom that you didn't counter because of your heuristic after they tutored for a Jeweled Lotus. I don't know. I'm just on all of the heuristics today. And so what they do is they stare at their board, they stare at the rest of the board, then they just you'll see something kind of wash over their face as their heuristic kind of almost takes control of them. And they say, just blankly, attack the ad naus player. They'll just say that. They'll just turn sideways and say, attack the ad naus player. Because you saw that heuristic take control of their mind. And they are they literally even just repeat it out loud. That's how much it has a hold of them. Now, are there times when you shouldn't attack the ad naus player? Yes, there are a ton of times when you shouldn't attack the ad naus player. And
do you have any examples today, Ryan?
I only have like 8 or 10. So thank goodness.
Let's get into them.
Yeah, let's get into it. Let's get into all the times when you probably shouldn't attack the ad naus player. So first of all, the reason that this heuristic exists is because the ad naus player is usually the one that gets the most card advantage off of their life, right? With the exception of even with Necropotence, you have to end up discarding a lot of the cards because you can't utilize them right away. So they might be paying 30 life and getting 7 great cards, so it's really good card selection, but they're still paying 30 life to look at 30 cards. However, ad naus gets access to all of them, not just the best 7. So you can even, you can use your Chrome Mox and dump the worst card that you got out of your ad naus pile.
And you're up mana, yeah.
Yeah, and you're up mana. And so the thing is that automatically attacking the ad naus player isn't necessarily always the thing to do first. Now, if you're very early in the game and you cast your turn 1 Crom and everybody's at 40 life, and you know that you're against a Grixis deck and 2 other decks, maybe a Winota or something like that, it makes sense There's a reason this heuristic exists, because, getting them off of that life is definitely what you should do. That's less cards that they get to pull off of their Adnos. All that makes sense. We're not arguing that this heuristic is bad. It's just that there's definitely times when you should not follow it. Rule 1. Is there a stacks piece on board that's holding down the Adnos player? If there is, reconsider the heuristic immediately. So that doesn't say ignore the heuristic immediately. It says reconsider it immediately. Somebody managed to slam down a turn 1 Thalia or a turn 1 3-ball. That Adnos player is going nowhere. So you might be able to then evaluate who might be the next biggest threat until that piece is removed.
It's the stacks player. You need to kill the stacks player so you can win the game.
Yeah, exactly. It's usually the stacks player. But so is there anything keeping down the Adnos player? If there's something that's keeping down the Adnos player, you don't need to keep beating the Adnos player further down. Well, what if they remove the 3 stacks pieces? Shut up. They're not going to remove 3 stacks pieces in an end step. It's not happening.
Are you sure about that, Ryan?
Yeah.
Are you sure? What if they overload Shattering Spree, huh? Got them.
Overload on sorcery speed, paying 3 extra, and then just shipping the turn? They're not doing that. Oh, it's so funny.
Shattering Spree, the right card? Is that what I'm thinking of?
It's
Destroy
not.
all
It's
artifacts.
Vandal Blast, but we got what you meant. Shattering Spree is the replicate
Shattering Spree
one.
is the replicate
Yeah.
one. Okay. Shows what I know about Magic the Gathering cards. My gosh.
Your head was in the right place. It was in the right place.
I got the other pay way too much mana to destroy all of the artifacts card.
Yep. So a classic example of this is the first Punt City that was hosted by Eminence Gaming. And this was last year at the time of this recording. And basically what happens, we were in the Final Four pod. Mike was on Winota. Charles was on a mono white deck. I forget exactly which one. Forgive me. And there was an Urza player and there was an Adnos player. It was a Timnacrom player. And people were attacking the Adnos player. Everyone except Mike. Mike was not attacking the Adnos player. He was attacking Charles. Now, this heuristic says you should attack the Adnos player, and that's what everyone was doing, except Mike. Mike wanted to be one of our members. Mike, the Winota player, kept attacking Charles, the mono white stacks player. There was 2 stacks players at the table, and Mike knew that the other players were going to attack the Adnos player, and he didn't have to spend his resources on also attacking the Adnos player. The Adnos player was getting into the 20s and the teens, and the people were still attacking him, and Mike was still attacking Charles, and Charles was begging Mike, stop attacking me. We need to attack this Adnos player. Charles knows the game. He knows how to play this game, and he knew that the right person to attack was himself, because he knew that if he could take Charles out of the game, then he didn't have to deal with his own stacks because they were just helping each other. And he knew that the Adnos player was whittled down enough that his Adnos was not going to be enough to just win the game on the spot. It was going to give him some stuff, but not enough to probably close it out. And he knew he also, if he couldn't win immediately off the Adnos, he had to save himself enough life to battle the combat math to get around to another turn. So Mike knew he was in a really good spot. And so Mike did not attack the Adnos player. Mike won that tournament. He did not attack the Adnos player, even though Timnacrom was absolutely a big threat to be had. But Mike had the foresight to see that there was a stacks piece holding him down. I believe it was from the Urza player. Maybe it was from Charles.
I think it was like a transfer or something like that.
He knew that that was the player to not hit. So what we're saying is just because somebody's in black doesn't mean you should automatically just swing at them every time. You should swing at the biggest threat at the table. Now, that usually frequently translates into the Adnos player because a person running ad nauseum in their deck is the biggest threat lots of times because they could just, just out of nowhere, just explode and win. It's just how it goes. That's why ad nauseum is so good. So a lot of times that heuristic does apply, but usually you want to attack the biggest threat at the table. And that's really what it boils down to at the end of the day. But it gets really condensed into attack the Adnos player to attack their life total.
Yeah, exactly, Ryan. And I actually have a similar example about this too recently. I think the biggest thing you need to watch out for is just make sure that the Adnos player is actually in a threatening position to win the game. And it's kind of different too. Like if you yourself are like loaded up on an interaction or something and think you can stop the Adnos player, maybe you don't need to attack them as much. Maybe you're more incentivized to try to whittle down the other players because combat damage wins don't happen all the time, but it happens sometimes. I think your example with Mike is a really good one. I think that's actually one of the strongest abilities that Mike has as a player that I've seen him demonstrate time and again, and why I think he has such a good performances with Winota all the time. Because like Winota is kind of just like often like limited gameplay combat math the deck. Like you kind of have to obviously the whole spin the wheel and put a whole ton of free stuff into play isn't very limited gameplay adjacent, but you have to make a lot of very tough decisions about how to attack and when to attack and who to attack in that deck. And I think Mike does that very well. I think that's a skill that a lot of cEDH players could pick up more on, because I think it could really up your win percent from time to time. But I had a similar thing happen in the same tournament I was playing on Saturday in my last game before I Salt O2 dropped to go home and mow my grass. I made an attack, and it kind of like I alluded to earlier, when you're playing a Malcolm deck. So this is a little more of a limited example. I decided to attack the Azusa player, not Azusa, but attack the player in the 4 spot who is still at 40 life, rather than the Mardu player who had 28 life. I decided to attack the person at 40 and brought them down to 38. And they were like, really? You're not going to attack the guy, the Ad Naus player with, the Necropotence in play? I was like, well, no, because they're playing Kyrnos and Kroxa, and there's a Grafdigger's Cage on the battlefield. There's a Rest in Peace on the battlefield. They're playing Mardu. They can't remove that card. They can't beat that card. I am not worried about them drawing 80 cards from their library right now. I'm gonna attack you. And those are the kind of situations that I think it's really important to be heads up about. Make sure you're always attacking the most advantageous person. Mm-hmm. That is, yes, 90%, 95% of the time, your most win percent boosting play will probably be to lower the life total of whoever is playing black at the table. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we get it. But be on the lookout for those other scenarios as well.
Yep. So classic examples of those would be, well, the Ad Naus player's been taken out. Who should I attack next? What do you do? Oh, attack the Ad Naus player some more? No, you might need to attack somebody else. Sylvan Library in green, yep. Attack that person. That's one less card for every Crom hit. One less card. They actually can't draw next their card. You're literally making them pseudo lose a card, and that's powerful.
With every Crom hit,
yeah. White players, a lot of them, whether it be Mardu, a lot of Tymna Crom decks still run it. Is Sarah Ascendant. Get them below 30 life. Now their Sarah Ascendant's a 1/1 for 1.
Yep.
Above 30 life, they're going to run away with that game if they get an early Sarah down.
Yep.
5-color mana bases usually are very painful. It hurts.
Yep.
A lot of fetch lands, a lot of shock lands. Yep.
Put them in the squeeze. Make them think about activating their City of Brass and Mana Confluence. Yep. I've been there. They're Ancient 2. A lot of decks play Ancient 2. Make a deck, make them scared to activate their Ancient 2 because, I'm at 12 now. I'm in the danger zone.
Mm-hmm. And you'll actually, when they get to those low levels, you actually start to see them counting up their pain lands, their Mana Confluences, whatnot. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely like different things that you can do. And I'm not saying just because somebody's at white and somebody else is an Ad Naus player at 40, you should just attack the person because they might have Sarah's in it. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying that these heuristics should be ignored. We're saying there is a table texture that sometimes you have to do to assess whether or not that is the best heuristic to apply at the time. This helps us get from beginner to apprentice to journeyman, if you will, or beginner to intermediate play, but it's ignoring these heuristics that allows you to go from intermediate to advanced.
Ryan, let's go ahead and move on to our last heuristic here on the list. I'm sure you could talk about attacking the Ad Naus player all day long.
I have a flow chart.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a flow chart of who to attack.
How do I attack them?
Especially if I'm the Ad Naus player, I can usually deflect and say, no, they have Sarah Ascendant. Oh, they have Sylvan Library. He's going to put down a Necropotence, I promise.
Yeah, exactly. But I mentioned that attack the Ad Naus player might be the second most mentioned heuristic of all time, vocally, and number one is definitely number one. And this is don't feed the fish /ristic. People don't say don't feed the ristic study really, but the heuristic is exactly the same. So don't feed the fish, which is to say, do not let people who control ristic studies and mystic remoras draw cards off of your game actions. Quote unquote, play the game responsibly. Don't let these people draw a ton of cards by you advancing your own board state. And I'll be honest, this heuristic exists for a reason, much like all of these other ones. This one may be the most justified. Somebody gets to pay 1 mana for a Mystic Remora on turn 1, and everybody else plays out their mana rocks and all this kind of stuff and casts Rite of Flame for some reason, and Vampiric Tutor on an end step off the Gemstone Caverns or what have you. And it suddenly adds up to, this person paid 1 mana or maybe a total of 2 mana if they keep it in play off of cumulative upkeep. And off of that 2 mana investment, they've drawn a total of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cards, over 1 to 2 turns. They're probably going to win the game. Mm-hmm. They've drawn a significant portion of their deck off of little to no mana investment, and they're still probably developing their board meaningfully in the meantime off of all these cards they're drawing. Yeah, that's a situation you want to avoid. Over the last year as well, people's perceptions of these 2 cards, Rhystic and Mystic, have kind of like flipped, in that I think a lot of people have, in my opinion, correctly, come around to Rhystic Study actually being like the better of the 2 cards. And I think that is because people are actually a lot less careful about applying this heuristic to Rhystic Study. They're like, oh, 1 mana? I can pay 1 mana, or I could play another spell this turn that I'm not going to pay for either. And that leads to people drawing a lot more cards off of Rhystic Studies. But this heuristic is a really tough one to evaluate and a really tough one to talk about, because these cards are so powerful. We talk about not letting people draw cards off of these excellent blue enchantments for a reason. People will run away with games if you feed the fish and whatnot. But when do you break this heuristic? When do you give that Mystic or Rhystic player a shot? The thing that a lot of people don't talk about when it comes to these cards, I mentioned it in passing already when I was kind of ranting there for a second, is that when people have a Mystic and Rhystic out, especially a Rhystic Study, since they only have to invest that 3 mana and then it just sticks around, they're drawing some cards off of them, and then they get to freely advance their own game. They get to freely advance their own board state without having to worry about a Mystic or Rhystic. Even if everybody at the table is like responsibly paying for a Rhystic Study, do you know how much it slows people down to always pay for a Rhystic Study? Most of the spells we're casting in cEDH cost like 1 or 2, maybe 3 mana. Rhystic Study is one of the few 3+ drops you actually see that aren't just like winning the game on the spot. And for that to become a 2, those 1 and 2 drops to suddenly cost 2 and 3, that's a monumental change. That's 100% and 50% increases in cost. That's a massive change in tempo. That's a massive, you have to think so much differently about how you're going to play out your turns if you're only going to cast these 2 spells instead of these 4 spells. But the Mystic Remora / Rhystic Study player, they don't have to worry about that. If you're paying for a Rhystic Study, it slows you way down. If you're not playing into a fish, you're not doing anything. You are not advancing your board state at all. When we're playing cEDH, we have to cast our Jeweled Lotuses. We have to cast our Talismans. We have to cast our Mana Crypts. We have to cast our Tutors. We're playing all these incredibly powerful non-creature spells. And if you're not feeding the fish, you're just like literally not playing the game. You're just going to draw, maybe play a land. Ooh, nice explore. A nice explore turn. Draw, play a land, pass it on to your opponent, and then the guy with the fish untaps and is like, well, for a 1 mana investment, I got my opponents to not play the game for a turn. I'm just going to let that die, and I'm going to play out all my stuff. And I just time walked everybody for 1 mana.
1 mana. For 1 mana. That's better than time walk.
And so these are the situations where you really have to sit and think. You're like, is me giving my opponent 1 or 2 cards, is my win percent higher from one of my opponents having 1 or 2 cards? Or is my win percent higher from me literally playing the game? Yeah, my opponent's going to draw off my Rhystic Study if I do Ancient Tomb, Talisman, cast Soul Ring off Talisman, or what that's not the correct way to sequence that play, but you get me. This thing, that is the entire wrong direction to go on that one.
Exactly wrong. You lose a floating mana, but that's fine.
Boo! Now you can't cast your Mana Vault.
Yeah.
Anyways, but your win rate, I am going to tell you, your win rate is going to be higher if you untap on turn 2 with 5 mana in play, compared to 2 mana off your second land you play, your win rate is going to be higher if you have 5 mana in play compared to your opponent drawing like 2 cards. It's just like you need to feed the fish in that scenario. If you kept a hand against a turn 1 fish that relies on you playing out 2 to 3 rocks, yeah, feed the fish. I'm just telling you, those are the situations in which you need to feed the fish, because by not playing the game, you are losing the game, especially in these situations that people don't talk about, like these fish packs or whatever. I love it when my opponent makes fish packs and I have an early fish. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to play my turn 1 fish. We're going to come around. I'm going to tap my land and I'm going to pay for my fish. And then I'm going to draw and I'm going to play another land and I'm going to cast a meaningful spell. And then everybody's going to go around and they're going to play their lands and they're going to be, oh, I can feed him 1 card this time. Yep. Okay, I'll draw a card. Yep. Okay. I'm so happy you didn't decide to do this last turn. And then we're going to come back around to me and I'm going to be like, well, my Soul Ring I played last turn is going to pay for my fish again, and then everyone's going to go around and they're going to go, oh, I don't know. Should I pay? Should I play? And they're all like, okay, I'll feed him 1 more this time since you fed him last time. And we get around, and it's my turn 3. I let my fish die. I have cast spells on my first 2 turns, and my opponents have not, and I've incidentally drawn a couple cards too. That is the ideal. I could not imagine a more ideal thing. I almost view like my mystics as like stacks pieces. If my mystics draw cards, I am overjoyed. I could care less about people feeding my fishes if they're just going to not play the game instead of feeding my fish. Mm-hmm. So let me tell you, from my perspective, you should probably feed my fish. Ryan, what do you think about this? I've been talking about this for like nearly 10 minutes now, so pop off.
So I basically agree with everything that you said. There's a couple of extra little nuances that I want to add as part of this. It is very common for somebody to say, like you said, fish pack. That's advantageous to a Mystic or more player as well. Just for all the reasons that you described. There's a little bit of nuance that I put into this that allows me to look over this heuristic and see whether or not I want to break this rule or, keep this rule. One of those is seat position. So if I am in the first seat and everyone says fish packed, right? I'm like, okay, he's the person who has the fish and I'm the very next player. And everyone says fish packed. Should I I'd be like, I'm not doing a fish packed. I'm not doing one. And I'll just burn out all my stuff. The reason that I'll do that is because they're not going to counter my Soul Ring. They're not going to do that. And if the other 2 want to keep their fish pack, they can. And they're in a very disadvantageous position because the first 3 cards a Mystic or more player might get will not necessarily be the interaction that stops you. It might be the interaction that might get them the game. So you have to be careful. And so seat position can play a very, very big role in it. If I'm in the 4th seat, I am actually in a very similar position if nobody played anything, if everybody respected the fish. And I'll say, okay, well, I'm in the worst spot. I'm in the dead last position. There is no way that I'm going to be able to win this game. So I am going to play my stuff in 4th seat too. Now, 3rd seat, what I will do is I will read the table. If the Mystic or more player plays and the first player doesn't play anything or plays a bunch of things, I will be a little bit more judicious about what happens because that player is probably going to put themselves in a spot where either player 1's going to win or player 1 is going to stop the win of player 2 trying to go off by advancing their board state. There's so much nuance to this. It's so hard to say, this is exactly when you should break the rule. This is exactly when you should follow the rule. And you have to be careful about, number 1, like you said, the Mystic or more player, just time walking everybody for 1 mana. Or number 2, people not adhering to a certain table heuristic and then throwing everything off kilter. So you have to talk to one another. Be like, hey, if everyone's looking to dump out their hand, maybe just dump 1 or 2 things out and save some interaction if you can. Or if there's a reason why you're dumping things out, make sure that that's there as well. But at the end of the day, it's really just tough. It's a tough spot to be in to begin with. So that's why a lot of times people will just automatically apply the heuristic. Oh man, turn 1 fish. I just won't play anything. And that way I don't have to get in all these layers and these complexities about seat position and who's doing what and who's not doing something and when should I break the rule and should I follow it. They just say, I just won't do anything. And I'll just sit here for 3 turns and play a land. That's bad. You don't want to do that because like you said, you're just straight losing that game. And the problem is that people don't say, wow, you really lost that game because you didn't play anything. They'll only blame you for losing the game against the Mystic Aurora player because you played too many things. They'll usually blame it on the player who feeds it. See what happens, they say? See what happens when you feed the fish? We lose the game because of you. They're like, actually.
Maybe you could have won the game if you had developed your board state. I don't know.
Maybe you could have been in a better position to help stop if you had developed the board state a little bit more. And it's not always like that. And sometimes it is like that, but that's usually the common heuristics that happens. Number one, don't feed the fish. And number two, blame the person who fed the fish on losing the game. That's
my favorite cEDH heuristic, actually.
Yeah, blame the person who fed the fish for losing them the game and get mad at them and salty because you couldn't feed it yourself.
You flip the table and you storm out, and it doesn't matter because you're besties with the store owner.
And then you go home and then you mow the grass.
You kind of cry about it on the internet. You kind of like make a little tweet and you're like, I can't believe cEDH is such a terrible format. I have to rely on other people to not lose the game. That's crazy. Yeah.
It's so stupid. Anyway, but but with Ristic study, like I almost never feed Ristic. I don't care what situation I'm in. I just, if you watch any of my gameplay anywhere, Masterpieces series, gameplay series, guest streams anywhere, you'll never see me feed a Ristic unless I'm straight out of mana. I always feed. I treat it as a stacks effect, not an option.
Yeah, it's like a Thorn of Amethyst or whatever.
It's a Thorn of Amethyst. That's exactly what it is every time. I will pay 3 for my 2 drops, 2 for my 1 drop. I'll pay for it every single time because it's only 1. I could still play the game. Mystic Remora is 4. It's just
Mystic
so much more
Remora doesn't really give you the option. In the really late game, if you're casting 1 spell, it's the only card you have in hand. Yeah, you can tap out to pay for the Mystic Remora in a late game, but otherwise, woo! Yeah, no option.
Yep, Mystic Remora could be a pseudo silence effect too in the late game. Yep. After post ad naus, first thing you cast is Mystic Remora.
Oh yeah,
that's a great one.
More cards.
Yeah, it's real great. Anyway, so that's basically, like I said, there's so much nuance to this, and I wish there was just an easy flow chart that just says, if you hear and you do this, then follow this and don't do. It's all about texture. It's all about board state, and you have to understand there's times when you should feed those elements. You should advance your board state because they're just winning the game over you. They're still advancing their board state, and you have to find a way to either remove that piece, which is worth them drawing a card, by the way. Here, red elemental blast your Ristic.
Yeah, draw a card. You got it, buddy.
Draw your card. Have fun. Have a nice day. Those are fine in those situations, but beyond that, you have to be careful about feeding those players, unless, of course, it's advantageous to do so. One other example: Grand Abolisher. Grand Abolisher on the stack. Sure, draw a card.
Yeah.
Can you counter it? Yeah. Can you counter it? Because if so, unless you have exactly a channel land, then I'm going to win the game because it's going to resolve.
Yeah. Well, I think that's about all we have to say about when you should break the rules of cEDH, so to say, or when you should skip out on some of these heuristics. Before the recording, in classic fashion, before the recording, I made a little joke. I was like, maybe this one will be a 25-minute episode, but that's okay. We could use some of those. And here we are, probably 50 minutes later by the time all the editing is said and done, after Zach cuts out all that junk. But to you, the listener, are there other times you should break the rules? Have you been personally burnt by breaking these heuristics in a moment of perhaps poor judgment? I know I have. Have you been rewarded? I definitely know I have. Is there some heuristics we missed? We kind of thought about this for a little bit, and these were the major 4 ones that we came up with. We would love to hear about other heuristics that you use and break yourself. Let us know about all of this in the comments or on Twitter or whatever. We would love to hear your stories. Make sure to give us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast aggregator. You may not know it, but reviews are basically the best way that you can help other people find the show. So even if you hate us and give us a 1-star review, it still helps other people find our podcast. So take that. Speaking of finding us, you can also find Playing with Power on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and more. All links, you can find them in the episode notes. That wraps it up for this episode of the podcast. Tune in next time when we talk more about our favorite format and our favorite game, Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and we will see you next time.